Chapter 761. $15 million was very tempting. Who would not be tempted by that amount of money? Quentin did all this for the money. He might have lost $7,500,000 in the process, but getting $15 million in return made everything worthwhile. Nolan took out his cell phone, contacted Quincy, and got him to inform the bank to prepare $15 million in cash. Quincy knew that something must have happened to Nolan, so he dispatched some men to Winston Island while getting the bank to prepare the money. Quentin was by Nolan's side while he was on the phone. Seeing that he did not play any tricks, he said with a smirk, "You've prepared to give out $15 million like it's nothing. You're really something, aren't you? By the way, I haven't asked you for your name." Nolan smiled. "I'm from Bassburg, and I own a company in Bassburg. You can call me Mr. Yates." "So it's Mr. Yates then. I'm sorry for my lack of manners." Quentin turned his head to the middle-aged man and said, "Why are you still standing here? Go and pour Mr. Yates a cup of tea." The middle-aged man returned to his senses and hurriedly poured a cup of tea for Nolan. Helios whispered, "What the hell do you think you're doing? You actually plan to pay these people $15 million? Have you lost your mind?" Nolan gave him a pregnant gaze. "You'll find out later." The bank on Winston Island received a call telling them to immediately prepare $15 million as a ransom for a person with a special status. Because it was a big withdrawal, the bank took it very seriously. Not to mention that the word ransom was mentioned, it was obvious that someone had been kidnapped. Thus, the bank director reported the matter to the local police vigilantly after receiving the call. Since the ransom was $15 million, it was only natural for the person who could give out that amount of money not to be an ordinary man. It happened that Maisie had gone to the police station before that and reported that someone had kidnapped and blackmailed her husband. The two incidents clicked instantly, so the police took the file that contained the information provided by Maisie and looked into the details of the case. They then realized that her husband's name was exactly the same as the name of the person who had gotten the bank to prepare the $15 million ransom. The police contacted Maisie immediately. Maisie seemed to have waited for this call on purpose and reported the situation pitifully on the phone. A few days ago, it was said in the news that Mr. Goldman of Bassburg had gone to Winston Island to learn about a project that he was about to invest in, which made everything she said consistent with what they knew. Winston Island was just an island. The developers would be able to suppress any news if it was not an event that was serious enough to stir up a commotion. Unfortunately, this incident happened to have gotten into the ears of the developers. The person who had brought the incident to the developers was Helios' assistant, Nina. As such, no matter how much the developers wanted to turn a blind eye to this issue, someone had provoked a person who was out of their league, caused a calamity, and offended a big gun from Bassburg. The developers could no longer sit idly as soon as they found out that their future interests could be embroiled in this incident and get sabotaged. Thus, they sent their men out there to investigate the situation and found out that Quentin, the local mob boss of Winston Island, was the one who was behind the crime. The developers' men were aware of what Quentin had done, but Quentin was a rather powerful person on Winston Island. He could bring them benefits too, so they usually ignored whatever he had done. But now that things had gotten a little out of control, the developers did not dare to fool around anymore. If this were to hit the media and anger the public, it would affect their business on Winston Island. The people inside were still unaware of what was happening outside. Quentin saw that nothing had happened after waiting for more than an hour and glared at Nolan. "Mr. Yates, are you playing with us again? It's been an hour and a half. Where's the money?" Nolan was sitting on the couch. He crossed his legs and changed his posture, leaning languidly on the back of the couch. "As far as know, Winston Island only has one in-time bank, and I asked for a $15 million withdrawal. Don't the employees need some time to prepare the money?" Chapter 762. The middle-aged man thought it made sense. Mr. Quinton, $15 million isn't a small amount. However, Quinton ignored him and glared at Nolan. I'm curious. Since you can come up with $15 million, why don't you transfer it directly instead of bringing it to us in cash? Nolan's eyelids twitched. I told you that I'll be paying you the $15 million in cash, and you've agreed to it too. Haven't you? Quinton thought of something all of a sudden and got up abruptly with a gloomy expression. Are you trying to buy time? Nolan neither denied nor admitted it. At that moment, someone hurried in from outside and shouted, Mr. Quinton. He approached Quinton, leaned over, and whispered something into his ear. Quinton then smashed the wine glass in his hand to the ground. You played me again. Quinton's subordinates approached the exit in an orderly manner and blocked it. Helios and Nolan were being held in the bathing area on the 5th floor and were unable to escape, no matter what. Nolan's expression looked calm, and he could not help but clench his hands that were resting in his pockets. Quinton spat. Fuck. I actually believed your words and gave you a chance. Since you have the balls to make a fool out of me, don't blame me for being rude. He waved his hand, and two strong men approached Nolan. Nolan raised his foot, kicked a chair toward them, making the two stumble for a moment, and dragged Helios to his feet. The man behind them smashed the wooden chair and used it as a weapon, but Helios kicked him, and he staggered backward. At the same time, the person who came at them from the side was dealt with by Nolan. Unfortunately, there were too many people. Although they were not professional fighters, they still put their lives on the line and fought ruthlessly. Even if Nolan had practiced martial arts before this, dealing with a group of men soon put him at a disadvantage. Both of them had exhausted their energy. Their suit jackets had long been discarded, more than half of the buttons of their shirts had been torn open, the fabric of their clothes had become wrinkled throughout all the brawling, and their backs were already soaked in sweat, making them look a little disordered. They were surrounded by a group of men and had no way out. A man swung the frame of a chair in his hand toward Helios, but Nolan lifted his arm to block it, breaking it in half. Nolan's arm shook abruptly, and the muscles in his arm trembled as they lost their strength. Someone took the opportunity to throw a punch at Nolan's face at that moment. Nolan took the punch head-on and lost his balance for a split moment but did not fall. The crimson liquid in his mouth oozed out through the corners of his lips, and he spat a mouthful of blood on the floor. Helios was subdued to the ground by a few men, his pupils constricted in an instant, and he yelled at Nolan, "Be careful." Taken by surprise, Nolan was strangled by someone from behind. And Quinton took a bat from one of his men and walked toward him with an ominous smirk. You're just an army of two, yet you have the balls to make a fuss in my territory? Helios gnashed his teeth. You'll regret it if you hurt him. Regret? Me? Quinton turned around to look at him. I don't think this word is found in my vocabulary. He swung the bat and hit Nolan in his leg. The men behind Nolan then released him, and Nolan fell to the ground on his knees. Nolan's face was flushed, and all the veins found on his temples down to his neck bulged. But he did not even make a sound. Quinton patted his cheek with the bat. You'll make quite a good sandbag. Helios roared, I dare you to come at me instead of him. Quinton gestured to the man behind him, and he punched Helios' cheek. Due to the impact, Helios' head turned to the side, and blood spurted out of his mouth. What's the hurry? It'll be your turn next. Quinton glanced at Nolan. I'll take care of the one who can take a beating first so that you people will know the fate of offending me. Quinton swung his bat and hit Nolan's head. Helios' pupils constricted. And the only thing that caught his eye at this moment was Nolan's body, which was dropping to the floor. Nolan. Everything around Nolan dimmed and faded away while all the ambient sounds disappeared. Everything that happened at that moment only came out as silent frames. Chapter 763. The police broke in through the door at this moment, and those who reacted to it fled, while those who got shot fell to the ground and were subdued. The scene was chaotic for a couple of minutes. Quentin was pressed against the ground, detained, and then taken away in handcuffs by 2 police officers. Nolan's vision turned blurry, and he vaguely heard someone shouting at him. "It sounds like Helios, and, Nolan." Maisie burst into tears, knelt beside him, and hugged him in her arms as warm tears dripped onto his blood-stained cheeks. Nolan saw Maisie, who was weeping before his eyes, and moved his lips, before completely losing consciousness. Nolan was carried into the ambulance and taken to the hospital. Maisie was always by his side, grabbing onto his hand, which was getting colder and colder. The doctor put a mask on Nolan's face to supply him with oxygen and performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on him. Upon arriving at the hospital, a group of hospital staff members rushed to the front to make way for the stretcher. "Please make way." Maisie was stopped at the door, while Nina and Helios arrived minutes later. Although Helios was also injured, his condition was not as severe as Nolan's. He looked pallid as he witnessed Nolan being pushed into the emergency room. Nina walked over to Maisie's side and leant her shoulder, and Maisie buried her face in her shoulder and started crying and trembling. She recalled the incident that had taken place 3 years ago, where Nolan had taken a bullet for her and had been sent into an emergency room too. She was terrified. Quincy arrived at Winston Island General Hospital with a group of bodyguards and looked at them. "Where's Mr. Goldman?" Helios sat on the bench and leaned forward, propping his elbows against his thighs. "He's inside." Quincy was stunned and stared at the emergency room door without saying a word. Helios clasped his hands together with a distressed expression. "I'm sorry. I'm the one who got him involved." Quincy lifted his arm and placed his hand on Helios's shoulder. A silent comfort could be considered the most appropriate console at this moment. The police came over, asking for more information regarding the incident, and Nina took them aside and cooperated with the investigation. The door to the emergency room opened, and the doctor removed his mask as he walked out of the room. Maisie rushed up to the doctor and asked with a dry voice, "How is he?" The doctor glanced at her. "He's no longer in a critical state, but," the pause in the sentence made Maisie clench her hands tightly. The doctor then continued, "Even though he's no longer in a critical state, the injury that he's suffered is a blunt force trauma to the head. It'll be a little troublesome if he still can't regain consciousness soon." She got what he meant implicitly. Nolan would most likely end up in a coma if he still could not wake up at that time. It could be even worse, as he would suffer from brain death and end up in a vegetative state. Maisie's face turned pale. Her strength was escaping from her body like a butterfly enclosing from the chrysalis, and her expression looked tense. They had not brought any bodyguards when they went to Winston Island because no one thought they would encounter such an unexpected and dangerous situation. She originally thought that she could buy some time for Nolan and try to get help. That was why she had gotten Nina to bring the issue to the developers of Winston Island. The developers had once hired Helios to endorse their hot spring hotel, so they surely knew Nina. With that, they would definitely realize that the situation was serious. And based on the influence that Helios possessed in the entertainment industry, anything that happened to him would definitely affect their business on Winston Island. That was why Maisie dared to bet that they would not just sit back and watch while Helios was in danger. Maisie also had faith in Nolan that he would not sit still and do nothing as Quentin held them captive. He would definitely find a way to buy her some time. She had been careless and had neglected the possibility of things going south. Maisie had been under the impression those people were only doing so for the money and believed they would not dare to kill anyone in the process. They had managed to arrive, but they were too late. Seeing Nolan being so badly injured and what those people had done to him, everything in front of her eyes was dimmed and blurry. Maisie walked into the ward. She was only a few feet away from him, but every single step that she took felt like she was climbing up a mountain with weights tied to her feet. She then stopped by the bed and stared at him. Nolan, tears streamed down her cheeks and gathered at the corners of her lips. You lied to me again. Chapter 764. Nolan had been in a coma for 4 days when Nicholas sent a private jet to Winston Island to transport him back to Bassburg Hospital. Quincy stayed back on the island to deal with the developers and Quentin. It was obvious that the incident had enraged Nicholas. And because of the injury that Helios had suffered, Yael did everything in his power to impeach the upper management of the Winston Island jurisdiction. All the hot spring businesses on Winston Island involved in violent crime and investment frauds were closed down. Even the directors of the development companies had to abandon their right-hand men to protect their reputations as they tried their best to cut ties with any hot spring businesses that Quentin owned. They even submitted a list of Quentin's accomplices to the police anonymously and the evidence of illegal activities he was involved in over the years. Even though the Goldmans and the Bouchers could not infiltrate Winston Island with their influence. This was the first time both families had their eyes fixed on the same goal for the sake of their son, and that was to demolish the fraud syndicates that existed on Winston Island. At the Boucher Manor, in the living room, Richard shook the table by placing his teacup on the table heavily. Are you planning to send me to my deathbed with this shit show? Helios stood there and had not uttered a single word. Although the bruises on his face had dissipated a little, the marks were still faintly visible. Yael looked at his father and said calmly, Father. It's a blessing that Helios has come back in one piece. Don't blame him anymore. He is who he is all because of your condonation. Knowing that his father was infuriated, Yael could only take the blame without talking back. I'm sorry. It's my fault. And that's it? Richard pointed at Helios. This is why I would disagree with the idea of him getting into the business circle. The business circle can, at times, be complicated and sinister. And this genius? He's actually ballsy enough to travel all the way to Winston Island with that brat from the Goldmans to talk about some random investment project? Yael lowered his head. Helios took a deep breath. You're wrong, grandfather. Richard glared at him doubtfully. But Helios' face looked calm and expressionless. The person who traveled to Winston Island in order to invest in a project isn't Nolan, but me. He has nothing to do with this incident. And I'm the one who got him involved. You, father, grandfather, I'm sorry. I know you have high expectations for me, but I don't want to live according to all your arrangements. I'm doing so because I want to locate my own path in life. Helios Boucher. Richard slammed the table and reprimanded angrily. Do you know what the hell did you just say? Helios lifted his head, exchanged gaze with Richard's wrathful glare, and gave off a faint smile. I'm well aware of that. I'm the eldest heir of the Bouchers. And I don't have many choices to choose from in life, because everything has been arranged for me since the day was born. What you want is for me to return to the family, inherit the family business, then marry the woman you arrange for me, settle down with her, give birth to a few children. And then spend the rest of my life just like that. You ungrateful bastard. You have such a blissful life, yet you're here complaining about it. Do you know that what you own is something that others can't even dream of? Of course. Helios scoffed. But for me. Is this any different from the life of the birds that are being locked away in the cage? Richard was taken aback. Helios looked out the window. You didn't allow me to befriend Nolan since I was a child because you thought he had always been an unrestrained and rude kid and wouldn't act according to how others thought he should. However, the thing that you don't know is how much I envied him back then. Helios had always been taught to obey his elders ever since he was a boy and that he should never talk back to his elders because they were never wrong. Even if he was not the one who did something wrong. He could not talk back when he was being scolded. He had to accept the reprimand humbly and listen to all the elders' arrangements. Thus, Nolan had not done anything wrong. He had just been a boy who would not let himself be wronged. Who dared to tell the elders their mistakes in their faces and talk back at them? In general, he had just been a rude boy in the eyes of Helios elders. He would only do what he wanted to do and preferred to listen to his own heart compared to the words of his elders. He would do whatever he thought would make things easy for himself or whatever would make him feel happy. In the eyes of the elders, he had always been a stubborn and untamable horse. Chapter 765. The elders of the Bouchers had never taken a liking to Nolan as a kid, and neither did Helios' grandfather. Still, knew very clearly that it was because he had met Nolan when he was a child that he knew what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of life he wanted to live, and how he could choose a path in life that would not make him regret it. He then added, "I wouldn't have grown up to be the Helios that you know today if I hadn't met Nolan back then." Richard's expression looked cold and stern. He got up and left with a sullen face in the end. Yael stopped in front of his son, raised his hand, and placed it on his shoulder. "Just do whatever you want to do." Helios froze in place and looked up. "Father," Yael's grasp intensified before he retracted his hand, turned around, and went upstairs. Helios walked out of the villa while Francisco was leaning against the wall, with his arms crossed. "Helios, I've regarded you as an idol ever since I was a boy because you excel in so many aspects of life when compared to me. Not to mention that you've always been the grandson that our grandfather valued and appreciated more." He faced Helios and grinned after saying that. "But I now realize that I seem to have lived a much happier life, so it turns out that I'm also a man that you would envy." Helios scoffed. "You're now the only hope the Bouchers have left, so don't learn from me." Francisco sneered. "Nah, I'll pass. I really like my current life, and I'm not interested in inheriting the Bouchers and its business. I find it extremely troublesome. Care to go for a drink or two?" Francisco was surprised. "You're actually asking me out for a drink? Are you trying to deceive me?" Helios patted him on his shoulder. "I'm buying today." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Maisie sat on the chair next to Nolan's bed, looking after him. She lowered her head and took a ring box out of her pocket. She had already designed and manufactured the ring long ago, thinking of giving him a surprise when they returned from Winston Island. Riley stuck her head out from the frame of the door. "Z." Maisie turned to look at her and forced a smile through the corners of her lips. "You're still here." "I was discharged from the hospital yesterday." "I'm here just to see you." Riley stopped next to Maisie and fixed her gaze on the box in her hand. "Is this the wedding ring that you designed?" Maisie nodded. The only thing in common that the two silver rings shared was the intertwined gold thread design that was carved horizontally onto the surface of the ring, and the extra diamond inlaid edge of the female ring resonated with the simple and elegant-looking male ring. Riley scratched her cheek. "Shouldn't Nolan give you the wedding ring?" She thought that men should be the ones giving wedding rings to women. Maisie smiled and looked at the man lying on the hospital bed. "Perhaps he wants one that comes from me?" Riley pouted. "Why does it feel like I just got bombarded with a lovey-dovey missile?" Maisie thought of something and asked, "How's Louis doing?" Riley was caught off guard and stunned for a split second. She then crossed her arms. "Louis, he's recovering at light speed and doing very well. You don't have to worry about him." Maisie looked at her for a while, lowered her eyes, and chuckled. "It seems that you and Louis got along pretty well when we weren't in Bassburg." Riley wanted to say something, hesitated, and did not utter anything in the end. She shifted her gaze away from Maisie, saw something inadvertently, and pointed at the bed. I saw Nolan's fingers move." Maisie turned to look at him, and Nolan was still lying on the bed, motionless. Thus, she complained helplessly, "Riley, that's not advisable if what you wanted to do was to divert my attention." "No." Riley's expression looked serious. "I really saw it. The index finger of Nolan's right hand moved just now. He's woken up." Maisie was astounded. Riley might love to joke around from time to time, but she wouldn't use Nolan's well-being in her joke just to cheer me up. Plus, she doesn't look like a liar. Maisie turned to look at Nolan again, lifted her hand, and held the back of his warm hand. Chapter 766. Before Maisie could do anything, Nolan's thumb lightly touched her finger. Riley laughed, and her shoulders shook. I didn't lie. Mr. Goldman is conscious. Maisie got up, sat on the edge of the bed, and bent down to look at him. She put his hand to her face and cried happy tears. Nolan, you can feel this, right? You can hear me too? But after a long time, Nolan didn't respond, nor did he wake up. Still, it was good enough that he was conscious. Nighttime at the club. Francisco carried Helios out of the room. Helios had drunk quite a lot and was drunk. Hells, you're not drinking, you're just buying alcohol. He helped Helios put on shades and a cap, then checked his pockets and noticed something. I dropped my wallet. Wait for me here, don't go anywhere. Helios leaned on the wall, bent down, and put his hands on his knees. He needed to throw up, but nothing was coming out. He stood up straight and gulped down some warm water before sitting on the couch. He took off his cap, ran his fingers through his hair, and then pushed it aside. His sharp features were extra attractive under the dim blue light, even with shades on. A woman in black lace walked over with a wine glass, sat next to him, and suddenly got close. Hey handsome, why are you sitting here alone? Helios looked at her briefly, but ignored her. She touched his face and turned it back toward her, her long legs bumping on his calf. Her red lips got close and blew at him. Are you interested in a game? Helios grabbed her wrist and moved her hand away from his face. Not interested, it's nighttime. Why are you wearing? The woman wanted to take off his shades, but Helios immediately stopped her by pushing her away, and he stood up. Stop. He was going to leave when the woman called for people to grab him. She put down her glass and walked toward him. Do you know where this is? This is the Glitz Club, my turf. The woman walked to his front and grabbed his chin. I'm interested in you. She moved her hand toward his shades. A woman's voice came from behind a few men. He's not someone that a woman like you can touch. The woman turned around and saw a woman wearing a turtleneck sweater walking over. She was wearing brand clothes from head to toe, but it was subtle because she wasn't wearing any jewelry. The 4 men behind her were her bodyguards. So she must have been somebody. The woman in lace was surprised. This was Glitz, so she wasn't afraid. Who are you? Outsiders have no right to interrupt. Barbara crossed her arms. Even the owner of this place respects me. So what are you going to do if I want to interrupt you? The woman didn't really believe her. At that moment, the club manager rushed over, saw Barbara, and smiled. I'm sorry, Miss Chase. Meg was just joking. She's drunk. The manager walked next to Meg and said, This is Miss Chase. The boss guessed. The manager whispered something into her ears, and her expression changed. Meg smiled. Miss Chase. I was just joking. If you know him, it's not fun anymore. Chapter 767. Meg left with the others. Helios heaved a sigh of relief and rubbed his forehead. Thanks for helping me get out of this. Barbara looked around. Aren't you afraid that you'll be recognized? Coming here alone? I'm here with my cousin. Francisco rushed over right after Helios said that. Hells, didn't I tell you not to walk around? Francisco finally found him, then looked over to Barbara. Who are you? Barbara was silent. Helios explained. She's Barbara Chase, from the Chase family. Miss Chase, oh, are you? Francisco pointed at her, but didn't know how to say it. He didn't know Barbara, but he had heard of Miss Chase. Barbara smiled but didn't say anything. She then reminded, Mr. Boucher is a celebrity. If he were seen in glitz, the rumors would explode in Bassburg tomorrow. You need to be careful. Helios smiled. Yes, ma'am. Barbara left with her bodyguards. Francisco was confused, so he turned to look at Helios. How did you bump into her? It was nothing. She helped me just now. Helios put on his cap, and they left the club. Francisco walked behind him and got into the same car. He unbuttoned his shirt collar and suddenly looked out the window. Isn't that Miss Chase? Helios looked out and saw Barbara standing in front of two men. Talking about something. By the way, how did you get to know her? I heard some bad rumors about her. She killed Helios wasn't listening to Francisco. He saw her bodyguards moving forward and taking away one of the men's cameras. Helios started sweating. The two men were paparazzi? Had they taken pictures of that incident? Barbara took the camera, deleted everything, and returned it to them smiling. You've put in a lot of effort to get some dirt on Mr. Boucher. The two paparazzi were angry but didn't say anything. Helios had been working for more than 10 years, but had never had any dating rumors. When they had finally gotten a chance to make some money, the chance was gone. How could they not be angry? We're just trying to make some money. You need to mind. One of the men looked at her and mumbled. Your own business. Barbara looked calm. I know it's hard, but you're bending the truth for money and ruining his career. Could you sleep well knowing that? The men's expressions changed. Barbara crossed her arms and sneered. You made it look like Mr. Boucher bought alcohol so he could hit on women and harass them. You're going to get attention with that and blow it out of proportion, but you know how it'll be if the photos leaked. The two men were exposed and looked at each other. They really were trying to get attention from this tempting piece of news. All celebrities had dirt, and when they had enough money, someone would come along and clear the air. They didn't need to care too much about it. But once they were exposed, they wouldn't get another chance and might even offend their peers. No matter what, they had to accept it. We've learned our lesson, ma'am. Please let us go. Barbara didn't say anything and gestured to the bodyguards to let them go. They zoomed off without even looking back. Afraid that she would change her mind. Chapter 768. The car parked nearby hadn't driven away. Helios watched the scene unfold and felt complicated. He was really too careless. Francisco asked, Hells, are we leaving? He looked back and rubbed between his brows. Let's go home. 1 week later, at Soul Jewelry. Uncle Kennedy. Why don't you rest a little longer? Maisie saw that he was already in his office and was worried about his injury. Kennedy raised his arm and smiled. It's almost back to normal now. It's fine. Don't worry. Maisie walked out of the elevator with him when Kennedy asked her about what had happened with them on Winston Island. The media knew what had happened there because it was so shocking, but the fact that Helios and Nolan had almost died wasn't known. The Bouchers and Goldmans hadn't announced it but rather settled it in private because there would only be problems if it was announced. She looked down and smiled. We were just there for a vacation. The investment was made up to cover for Mr. Boucher. Kennedy nodded. Winston Island is a little chaotic. It's great that you didn't get involved. Maisie smiled and didn't reply. In the afternoon, Riley went to see her because she wanted Maisie to get some work clothes with her. Maisie was surprised. You're going to work? Riley scratched her cheek and smiled. I have a chance to interview at the Royal Academy of Music. She covered her face after that. I am not ready. I'm afraid I might not be able to perform. Maisie chortled, got up, walked to her, and put her hand on her shoulder. Let's go get some clothes. It's not every day that my Riley gets to join the Royal Music Academy. Riley leaned on her shoulder. I know you're the best. They got to the mall and shopped through 3 of 4 floors of fashion stores. Riley never had to put on office clothes, so she didn't know what to pick. Maisie helped her the entire way. Maisie picked a few, but they didn't look suitable. If it were an interview in a corporation, it might work. But Riley was going to interview as a lecturer at the Royal Academy of Music. The outfits would look too boring. Riley whispered in her ear, "Aren't these a little too old?" Maisie turned and looked at her. "They wouldn't you wore them." Riley pouted. Maisie stared at her for a long time before looking down at herself and shrugging, "What's wrong?" She touched her chin. "You're going for an interview at a music academy. You probably can wear something that fits your job and still looks interesting." Riley was suspicious. Maisie drove her somewhere near Antique Street to a tailor. She opened the door, and the dresses on display were in all designs and colors, and each one presented a different unique elegance. Riley was stunned. She looked around the shop at the dresses on display. "My gosh! Isn't this too formal?" The shopkeeper walked over and enthusiastically asked, "Welcome. Are you here to get a dress? We can customize any design that you like based on your measurements and height." Maisie pushed Riley forward. "Please pick a suitable one for her." The shopkeeper smiled. "All right, please follow me." Riley followed her. The shopkeeper showed her a few designs and let her try them on. She went into the fitting room with the few chosen dresses in her arms. Chapter 769. Maisie sat on the couch and flipped through a magazine. Riley put one dress on and walked out. The color made her look old, so Maisie shook her head. She changed into another one, but the color was too bright. It wasn't suitable. Riley changed a few times. But Maisie shook her head every time. She asked the shopkeeper to bring the one that she had looked at just now to her and sent Riley back into the fitting room. It looked a lot better than the few before that. After trying on a few more, Riley leaned on the wall, exhausted. I'm going to die from trying." Maisie thought with a hand under her chin and pointed at the one that the shopkeeper was wearing. "Try that one." "Another one?" Riley was tired. Maisie nodded. Riley had to go in again. Maisie stood up and walked toward her when she came out. The dress she was wearing was light green with white embroidery, and the collar was velvet lace. The fresh color looked great on her, giving the impression of the warmth that could melt snow in spring. Bright colors didn't look good on Riley. Bright colors made her look cheap. But plain colors looked great on her in comparison. Maisie turned and looked at the shopkeeper. "Take measurements based on this design. By the way, use pearls to replace the lace. Custom-made dresses could be altered based on the buyer's preference." The shopkeeper nodded without hesitation. "All right." After her measurements were taken, Riley went to the counter to pay a deposit. One needed to put down a deposit for custom-made items and pay the rest later. The deposit was $300. After it was ready, they just needed to pay $785. So the total was around $1,100. Riley sadly tapped her purse. "My purse is skinnier now." Maisie laughed, walked up to her, and tapped her shoulder. "Don't worry, my cousin can pay for you." After saying that, Maisie knowingly smiled. "Why don't you get a hair makeover too?" Riley looked at her in surprise and touched her hair. "What are you trying to do?" Maisie looked at her, and her smile widened. She quickly brought Riley to the salon. Tony at the salon let Riley sit on a chair and said to Maisie, "Ma'am, trust in my skills. I'll definitely make her beautiful." Maisie smiled. "Thank you." Riley flipped through the fashion magazine and took a deep breath. "I'm just going for an interview." "Do I need a makeover?" Maisie looked at her through the mirror. "You need to have a good impression during an interview." Tony agreed. "Yes, if you look great when attending the interview, you might bump into your true love." The corner of Riley's lips twitched. She was wondering whether Maisie would bring her for some cosmetic surgery later. Riley had always had square bangs, but Tony made her bangs wispy and airier this time, showcasing her eyebrows and forehead. Riley had a nice facial shape, and her head was round. So having square bangs made her look more tired. She looked like someone who didn't care about their appearance. After her bangs were changed, she looked more energetic and charming. When everything was done, Riley opened her eyes and looked at herself in the mirror, looking shocked. Tony tossed her hair. "How is it? More beautiful?" Maisie walked next to Riley and smiled at her through the mirror. "Not bad. You look more energetic." Chapter 770. Riley and Maisie left the salon. Maisie saw how Riley hung her head and looked lazy, so she put a hand behind her back and tapped it. "Stand straight, be confident." Riley didn't know if she should laugh or cry. "I'm just going for an interview." "Is this necessary?" Maisie said in a serious tone. "Of course, think about it. A lot of professors at the music academy are young. You should focus on your presentation. You can't attend an interview without being serious." Riley thought what Maisie said made sense, so she nodded. "You're right. I'll stand straight." She stood straight. Maisie chucked and poked her waist. "Be more natural." Riley avoided it out of reflex and covered her waist. Maisie wasn't happy, so she tickled her. They laughed out loud, ignoring the stares of the passers-by. At the hospital, Helios walked into Nolan's room, placing the flowers in his hand into a vase. Nicholas walked in and saw Helios, then paused. "Helios, you're here." Helios turned, looked at him, and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Goldman, I'm sorry." Nicholas waved his hand. "It's all right. Don't apologize. I never blamed you." Nicholas looked at Nolan. "It's his choice, and I believe he never regretted it, so why would I blame you?" Helios' hand balled into a fist. Nicholas stood next to him and lamented. "You spent a lot of time together when you were children. This kid always got you into trouble and offended your grandfather. Even his mother and I were really worried that he might be a bad influence on you." Helios loosened his fist, looked down, and smiled. "I don't think that he's naughty. I quite miss the times when we got into trouble together." Helios had to study and learn when he was at home. His grandfather would be very strict with him, and since his parents were very busy, they pretty much hadn't had time for him. The only joy he had had was spending time with Nolan. They weren't extremely close, because they would always offend each other for no reason. But when he needed help, Nolan would look like he was taking advantage of him but would still help him. After Nolan's mother's incident, Nolan had stopped playing with Helios. He had taken over Black Gold while Helios entered the entertainment world, but they knew what was happening with each other's lives. When Helios' father had thrown his birthday party 3 years ago, Helios could guess that something had been going on with Nolan and Maisie when the former gave her a positive evaluation. When Helios had first seen Nolan bring Willow to a party 9 years ago, everyone had been speculating whether she was his girlfriend, but Nolan never admitted to it. But during the party the Bouchers had held 3 years ago, Nolan's attitude made Helios notice that, and to test him out, he had asked Maisie for a dance. He had got his answer from that. Nolan had feelings for her. After that, Riley had brought the 2 children over. And Helios could immediately tell that both of them looked exactly like Nolan. Helios had been aware that Nolan had fallen into a scheme 9 years ago, but the woman that had supposedly saved him was Willow, and Willow didn't have kids. Helios knew his cousin Riley well. And Maisie was the closest to her, so he wasn't surprised when he later found out that the children were Nolan's. The second time Helios had seen Maisie was at the Somerton auction. He had been aware that Nolan was there from the start. That was why he had invited Maisie to the first floor and raised the bid together with Nolan.